And in fact, especially if they have good teachers, because this is the key to a good teacher, is that they're not overly, like a parent actually, they're not overly strict and like strong fisted, but they're also not, or short fused, right, or timered, but they're also not too laid back and aloof and like, meh, I don't really give a fuck. They have to be in that balanced spot where they have good qualities of both extremes to balance themselves out. That's the best kind of parent. That's the best kind of teacher. Another key point to a good teacher and parent, but especially a teacher at that point, is that they have to be able to understand how to make a class entertaining, because in order to be engaging and thus be remembered, and actually people learn it not just willingly, but their brains want to learn it and be like, I like this. And so in words, that's called engagement. It's engaging and focusing on the topic, whatever the heck the class is about. That's the only happens with entertainment.
Exactly.
It has to be made entertaining in order to be engaging, and then that's the only way. If it has to be engaging in order to be retained
Exactly.
and actually learned, and actually have the best graduation rates, so to speak, and everything else, because it wasn't like, oh, this was forced or a fabricated number, or like we had to do all these makeup classes because kids
Blah
just
blah
didn't
blah.
care. It's because they literally fucking did what they're supposed to as a good educator, and that's make it engaging and
Exactly.
involved and fun, so that, especially if it involves equally hands-on, if not make it fully hands-on, so that way literally they get the hands-on lived experience as well of learning these things. And especially with those other topics that you'd replace the advanced stuff beyond the advanced basics with those home ec and the gardening or the mechanics of the whatever, all the different things, right, these necessary skills, that's the best ones to have fully hands-on as well.
I wanted to make a point. The point being that in the educational system, it's basically taught as fact in that regard. I believe legitimately that should be abandoned in some cases essentially, because ultimately, like in, well, let's say history, or rather science in that regard, there's certain worldviews where science can actually be given another interpretation, i.e., quantum science,
Yeah.
or heck, even history in that regard. I mean, all we have basically in regards to biblical history is, well, basically theory. We should encourage children to come up with their own theories.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, but that's universally across the board.
Yeah,
Yeah, because that's part of also becoming your own person.
exactly.
That's especially true for parenting though. Like that's
Yes,
one of the most infuriating things about parenting, especially modern day, and also like the 80s and back, is that parents are so famous for never letting their kids fucking think for themselves or do things and screw up on their own or whatever.
exactly.
And then, because the best way to parent is to, especially, like I said, it's that balance, right? So what you do is you allow them to go out on their own, especially once they get like old enough, like they're, you know, I'd say like 8 to 12. If you're in a relatively safe neighborhood or whatever, a cul-de-sac or wherever else, you can let them go out and play outside. Obviously, you're still going to check in on them every so often. You're still going to keep a relatively close eye on them, but you're going to be at a distance. Maybe you're in the house or whatever. You're just going to make sure that they're obviously safe,
Exactly.
because that's also important. You're just not being a helicopter parent where you're like, I'm going to police you. I'm going to stare at you like I'm a surveillance camera, and I'm never going to let my eyes off of you because I control issues is my middle name. Anyway, but yeah, there's too many parents like that out there too. But so you have an example of that, and then once they get like 12 and older, then you let them literally go out with their friends or to their friends' places, or you go let them go out on the walk to a restaurant if they want to go there, or arcade nearby or something. You let them do what they ride their bike somewhere. You let them be on their own fully. You don't have to literally just always have an eye on them, and then that way, obviously you probably have a plan of like, if you feel uncomfortable at any point, or if like you get too tired, or if like something feels off, whether it's like you feel like somebody's following you, or like something just doesn't feel right. We know our area, so if you're on like a bike ride or something, you're going for a walk, and you see anything like that happens, obviously you go to this location, and you immediately text us. You can text us a letter, and we'll agree on the letter, you know, so it's literally instant text. And then that way we know, okay, we're going to go to that location, we're going to pick you up, because obviously
Exactly.
something's not right. Like, obviously you have that fail safe in there to make sure that they're okay, but at the same time it still shows that kid that you trust your kid to be on their own. You trust them to take care of themselves, potentially protect themselves if need be, God forbid, but like they'll be okay, and you know that they'll be, you know, they can trust you to trust them, and vice versa.
Exactly.
And that's the best thing that a parent can do, especially once you get to like 12 and up, because
Exactly.
that's that then also encourages them naturally, which is a very natural process biologically in any teenager, is that once they get to like 12 and up, they're going to have all those like much more serious important talks and questions that they want.
Exactly.
It's going to be uncomfortable and awkward, but as your parent, as a parent, right, you got to be
You
willing to
gotta
talk
have
about
them.
it. And like, but you also would expect them by that point, because
Yeah.
that's natural. That's usually when it comes up on their own, whether somebody around them or their peers mentioned it, a teacher mentioned something, they read it, they saw an article or a headline or read something in a book, whatever the hell it might be, saw a movie, you know, now they're curious about something. You let them, in other words, the point is that at that point you're letting them come to you to
Exactly.
ask you a question. And then at that point, you're not telling them your belief or your viewpoint on it necessarily, but rather, or how you feel about it. But you're saying, like, you're going to say, try to remove your bias and just tell them in an educational sense exactly what the, you know, the right answers in terms of education. Right? Like, that's the best thing you can do, because that's the middle ground. And then again, that once again shows that you trust your kid, and they can now trust you fully.
Exactly.
So they're also therefore be much more likely to actually be willing to tell you certain things that normally kids might keep, especially teenagers might keep as a secret, because they know they can trust you, you know, and you could help them with something or whatever. And that's a huge thing, because obviously if you go too much of a tyrant, so too much of a helicopter parent, too careful or too strict or too watchdog like, you know, controlling, the issue too protective, then the issue becomes the fact that now that kid's going to be more likely to rebel. They're not going to trust themselves. They're certainly not going to trust you with anything, because they've proven you can't be trusted, and therefore they no longer have the security to trust themselves, really, because you don't trust them, obviously, or else you wouldn't parent like that. So that creates potentially a trauma as well in their head, because now they're a more insecure person, because how did they trust themselves if you couldn't trust them because you never trusted them, right?
Exactly.
And then so they're never going to come to you with anything, and then that potentially endangers them more or whatever, you know,
Yeah.
makes them more insecure, makes them less capable of a person long term going into adulthood, which is creates more problems, especially in relationships or whatever else, God
What's
forbid.
this?
But
Yeah.
then if you're the opposite way around, and you're way too aloof and removed, and you just don't really care, you're one of those way too excessively laid back parents, like, do whatever the fuck you want whenever you want, I don't give a fuck, and you're just never there, you know, and or you're just literally never there, and you just, a lot of parents, you know, like, I grew up with a kid, well, some of the years I grew up, there was a kid on Sugar Plum next street over that was named Lane, and he was Jewish, but he was ethnically and religiously Jewish, his family was. But I think his mom was in prison and his dad was in and out of prison. But his
Hmm.
dad also made a lot of money. But he lived in his grandma's house, and his
Hmm.
grandma's health, of course, was deteriorating pretty quickly.
Hmm.
But he was also there home alone a lot of the time because grandma also worked.
Hmm.
And, you know, this is a true kid. Like, he's elementary school kid. You know, so he's still single digits into early preteens. And his dad was never there as a result. His mom was never there because she was in prison the whole time. He was never there because he was either in prison, or he was, when he was out of prison, he was just always doing whatever the fuck he did to get money.
Yeah.
And so his dad would just like occasionally just buy him all these lavish gifts.
Hmm.
Well, he wouldn't bring them to him personally. He had them shipped to the house that he lived in with his grandma, who was alone by himself most of the time because grandma usually wasn't there, and if she was usually asleep or whatever. So all he had to show for love from his parents was
A
these
gift.
stupidly lavish gifts. Like, he had a go-kart, he had you know, what's irony is that this is a low-income neighborhood that we grew up in Aloha. So that was like unheard of. So he was like, it was notable because you noticed him as if you didn't before, like I did before. But if you noticed him, usually it was because it was after he got like the go-kart and he'd be zipping it around, you know, a few blocks in the area or whatever else. And like that's another way that you can be the opposite kind of a parent, where you're too aloof and removed. And then that also creates the same thing that the overly strict one does, except arguably a lot of times more severe, where you don't trust yourself you're way more insecure of a person because you also never truly had the love from your parents or the support or the care, and you literally had to grow up when you're like 5 to care for yourself.
Exactly.
And then that potentially makes you delinquent and everything else, which he did get into trouble off and on with the police because he did get into delinquency every so often, understandably, because he's a fucked up kid because he just didn't have his parents around. And I always felt bad for him. But like as an example, you know, that's another kind of parent. That's also why that's bad parenting. And so it is related to the educational system because of like what he said, including the religious aspect that you could relate it to. It's especially true for parents because arguably actually your most important teacher is going to be your parent, just like what should be your best friend, at least growing up, should always be your parents as
That's
well.
actually my belief. Your best teacher is going to be your parent.
They should be.
Yes.
Most parents are not good teachers.
True.
That's the problem, and you and I both know that from a certain standpoint, and I'm sure plenty of other people out there do too.